Hello, and welcome to another discussion with the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. Today we're going to be talking about how we can practically pilot data trust and the steps that we can do, whether we're a member of the public, we're a member of the private sector, how we can work across sectors and nations to make data trust real. I'm excited because we have a very action-oriented panel today that's going to provide these pragmatic recommendations. First, I want to turn to George. George, if you could real quick do a quick intro as to who you are, and then tell us, why do data trusts matter? And what are the broad outlines of what a possible pilot might look like involving data trust?
Thank you, David. I'm very pleased to be here. I am the digital lead for Willis Towers Watson, a big consulting company, and I'm about to publish a book that kind of reflects all my anxieties, worries, and hopes for the future. And one of my big worry, and not just mine, is when you look into the most immediate future, into the economy, the economy of the 21st century will be an economy powered by data. And the debate around how we capture that value from the data, who captures that value from the data, and how we protect privacy has always been around regulation. And the argument is that regulation will solve this power asymmetry between individual citizens and big corporates, right? But we see that this fails. At any moment, for example, that I have to accept cookies, I mean, what are the chances? What are the options do I really have? So data trust, the reason why data trust, I find this idea so exciting, I look forward to discussing that with you and the other panelists today, is because it turns the table on that status quo right now. It introduces two very important ideas. Idea number one, it separates the collection of data from the processing of the data. So it's not like in sort of big companies, we can think of the Facebooks and Googles of this world, where the collection, the processing happens under one roof. So it separates the two. And secondly, it creates a new type of governance around the collection of data, whereby the governance is taking place by, let's say, some trustees or the people who are responsible for the data trust have fiduciary responsibility to the data owners. That is very new, because if you think of, the corporates, the people who collect data, the fiduciary responsibility is to the shareholders rather than the data owners. So it does turn the tables, and I look forward to discussing a lot more in the details and the practical steps we can take in piloting those data trusts.
Excellent, George. And what I loved about that is, like you said, it's recognizing that there's responsibility not just to shareholders, but also thinking about the data owners and the data producers, and what we can do, like you said, to change how we govern so that data is done with people as opposed to people. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Divya Chandler, who was able to join us today. I know you're quite busy, both with what you do as an anesthesiologist and neuroscientist, and would be interested, though, because you're also very much focused on how data, the same thing that George was talking about with data coordination, need to be done, not just in the health field, but actually for thinking about globally how we do data. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, Divya, as well.
Hi, well, good morning. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. As David mentioned, I'm both an anesthesiologist and critical care doctor, as well as a neuroscientist. And that might seem somewhat at odds with being someone who cares about data, but I also work as a data scientist. I collect a lot of data from human beings. And in some sense, the biometric data that we capture is some of the most important data that we deal with. So in that sense, for me, the way we collect data at the outset is the most important part of that process. I don't believe in adding in privacy or data protections as an afterthought. It's very hard to build a system of data trust when the trust portion is the afterthought. Secondly, mining people's data for the sake of profit or shareholders is not what this needs to be about. So principle one for me is putting privacy in first. But that second piece of it, that you were talking about, George, was really, really important. During the pandemic, we realized that one of the issues that we had was this inability to actually integrate data for the sake of public health from multiple sources. Part of it is because data is not very interoperable. People label it differently, they collect it differently, they name it differently. So it's very difficult to create action insights. But once you mention to people, let's do that. For instance, with contact tracing, people become noticeably concerned about the loss of their privacy. And there are different cultural approaches to this, but it seems like centralized contact tracing works better, but there is the potential for surveillance in that model. And when we take responsibility for our own actions in a contact tracing sort of world, it doesn't seem to work as well. So the question becomes, are there ways to decentralize data, secure it as it's being produced, and then aggregate it after the fact and only provide the keys to those we really trust? And so I've been working with a couple of other people to actually form that kind of network fabric to enable that data action to take place.
Excellent. And Divya, not to put you on the spot, and you can pass if you don't want to, but given the recent news that a certain country may or may not have a COVID-19 vaccine, if you were to recommend other countries that would want to do a data trust to help inform vaccine safety, vaccine efficacy, real quick, what would be maybe some principles that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think one of the principles is that data shouldn't only come in from centralized sources. Data should be, once it's authenticated, the sources, we should enable that data to come in from anywhere it can. And that way others can actually test it, act upon it, and share insights. So if this vaccine is distributed and there are negative reactions, we need to be able to find out about this early on, what those reactions were, and perhaps why they're taking place. So I think that ability to share and authenticate sources in a decentralized fashion is the key.
Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate it, Divya. And next, I'd like to turn to Michael. So, Michael, I'll ask you sort of the same questions I've asked George and Divya, which is, why do data trusts matter, and what are some broad outlines? And if real quick, you could also introduce yourself and what you're doing in the data space.
Yeah, sure thing. Let me, I'll start by introducing myself. So I'm Michael Ingrassi. I'm the President and General Counsel of Truata. We're a tech startup based in Dublin, got about 75 employees. And what we focus on entirely is actually the privacy enhanced analytics of data. So we develop solutions, software and other technologies for privacy enhanced data analytics. Now, the reason that, here in the panel really is that the company was founded actually in 2018 by our investors, MasterCard, IBM, and others, via a novel trust structure, actually. So we're actually held by our investors via a trust structure. So we're actually one of the world's first, as far as I'm aware, true data trust. But there's actually two different forms of data trust, I think, to kind of lay that out at the outset. You have the operating company data trust, and that's what we are at Truata, right? Where the asset held in trust is the company, and the beneficiaries are the investors. The trustee is a holding company that's independently managed, and there's a trust deed that sets forth the rules of the road. So that's one form, but the more common form, the one that I think we're going to focus on here, is a bit different, and that's what I'll call more of effectively a clearinghouse data trust, where you effectively have the trust asset rather than a company that needs to be handled pursuant to a trustee that's very intricate in what the company can do and how it can handle data. The asset's really the data, and it's coming from people. They're the contributors. They're also really the beneficiaries invariably. And the trustee, and that's going to vary, but the trustee is, say, some centralized admin body that determines and allocates use of the data and access to the data, but again, pursuant to a trust agreement. So two different forms, but obviously coming from where I am, the company I'm in, I'm pretty vested in the idea of making sure that there is this recognition of the value in either case to use of data trusts in the modern world.
Fascinating. And if I could ask you a quick rejoinder, I mean, how do you find when you're talking to CEOs that may not be familiar with data trusts, like how do you bring them along the journey? Because obviously you're much further ahead. You're actually a vanguard of where probably a lot of other countries and companies need to be 3 to 5 years from now. But how do you bring CEOs along in that journey if they're not familiar with the concept?
Sure thing. So when we're talking about Truata and we're talking about the operating company type of data trust, what it really is selling folks on what we believe in, which is that and George touched on this, there's a legal regime or legal regimes that companies need to comply with and should comply with, but then there's effectively a different standard, a moral standard that for some folks and some companies is at a higher level. And that's what we adhere to, and that's what's embedded in our trust deed. And the question for CEOs of the companies we work with is, at the end of the day, what's your standard? Are you looking to, when you use data, are you looking to satisfy your legal obligations and then call it a day? Or have you built a company and a brand and a relationship with your customers that should be aligned with how you use their data, that calls for you to adhere to, say, a higher standard? Much as companies have done in the past with, you know, the eco-friendly green movement, the organic movement, the fair trade movement, et cetera. It's, where do you put yourself? What's your standard? Is it the legal threshold or a higher threshold?
Very well said. Thank you, Michael. That is inspiring, and maybe we can start to see the equivalent of Energy Star ratings for data. That would be really impressive. So, so with that, I'd like to turn to Wally. And Wally, really glad to have you here as well. If real quick, could you introduce your background and role, and then what are your thoughts as to why data trusts matter, and what might be the outlines of broad pilots in this space?
Sure. Yeah, great to be here. My name is Wally Treno. I'm the CEO of a company called Sightline Innovation based in Canada. Uh, I guess my brief story is I had a company right out of university that did some interesting things, like the first mobile open source, or sorry, first mobile development shop, one of the first around 20, I would say, in the world, and first open source installations for the Canadian government in the late 90s. And we sold a IoT application server to BlackBerry, or then called Research in Motion. And it had the funny property of being, as far as we can tell, the first closed source server-side product written in the Python programming language. This was in the early 2000s. It was a very radical language back then. I actually had programmers quit because they refused to program in it, which I found interesting.
And now Python is in such high demand. It's crazy.
Yeah, you know, just really quick, like I remember my first night of programming Python, I rewrote 6 months worth of work from a team of 6 people in 8 hours, first time using the language. So the productivity of it was really impressive. And when we got out of the acquisition, selling that to Research in Motion, just thought we'll just do the same thing. Let's build an AI application server in 2011, started doing deep learning research in 2013. And then kind of the big AI sort of game hit. And through working with the Canadian government, on a number of different projects, started to realize, you know, hey guys, not talking as someone trying to sell you software, but as a citizen, you know, you may want to kind of take a look at the data aspects here and think that, you know, recognize that healthcare data in Canada, in my opinion, as a citizen, should be considered a fiduciary asset in the same way as a tax receipt. And you know, if a cloud company should make $1 trillion building a predictor that can tell you when I'm going to get cancer and how to fix it, you know, Canadian citizens probably going to want a take of that. And basically, we took those concepts and rolled it out into the first, what we think is the first data trust architecture. At the time that we announced that in 2018, the only organization out of the term data trust that we could see was the ODI out of the UK. And basically, what a data trust is, the way that we look at it, there's obviously a lot of different definitions, but a data trust is an enterprise collaboration framework to allow people and applications and organizations to collaborate in a secure way and solve problems that are really not solvable on your own. And you know, one of the underlying principles of that, I think, is about ethics and accountability and fiduciary responsibility. And the way I like to think of it is, you really can't have ethics if you don't have accountability. You really can't have accountability if you don't have ownership. Otherwise, who's got accountability for it? You really can't have ownership if you don't have a way to exert ownership, kind of like digital rights management of the media industry being applied here. So that's kind of how we got here. You know, in terms of opportunity, I would say if you'd asked me 4 months ago what the biggest opportunity was, I would say that, you know, data assets and the monetization or recognition of those as financial assets is really only made available to drive multiple expansion in the top tier of tech companies around the world. But there's a ton of other companies running hospitals and medical systems and cable networks and all these things who own the last mile relationship with the customer and have an inherent advantage to, you know, have a direct relationship in a specific domain, but they just don't have the technology to do that. So, you know, the big challenge there is, how do you finance it? And I think the biggest opportunity is to make it so companies like a cell phone company, for example, Canada is a very big country. The cell phone company is pretty expensive over here, but they tell you, you know, we got to put up a lot of poles to cover this entire, you know, telephone poles and cable poles and things like that. Well, there's a ton of data in that network. Why don't you figure out a way to make a financial value out of that, stick it on your books, and you'll get some more financing for it. That was the biggest opportunity until the world hit with COVID. And now I think it's about GDP protection and trying to fight the erosion, because we used to talk about some future day where unemployment could hit 20% maybe over the next 10 years, and what are we going to do about it? And now, 90 days later, 120 days later, here we are. So the big opportunity is, how can we combine and collaborate across multiple jurisdictions, multiple applications, multiple organizations, and really meet the imperative need to address the global crisis brought on by COVID.
Excellent. Thank you, Wally. And I liked what you were sharing, which is we need to think about how there is a interplay between fiduciary responsibility and data responsibility, which is actually a great pivot to the question I now have of George, which is, who would fund a data pilot? How would we fund it? What are ways that we could go about doing it? So we're interested in your thoughts, George.
So let me answer this question by picking on a point that Wally made before, and a real story, a very real recent story, right? So American Airlines put up as collateral in order to draw a government loan under CARES Act of $4.75 billion. The collateral was their loyalty program, which was data. Now, AAdvantage, which is the American Airlines that holds that asset, has no tangible assets. Now, that single data asset was valued to between 18 and $30 billion, right? Okay. So what does that story tell us? That story tells us that if you have a good use case, right? If you can bring together some valuable data around the data trust, then perhaps you can fund this data trust through issuing bonds, for instance, right? Okay. So there are innovative ways, and that's like a very basic idea that I'm just offering now. Okay. There's financial geniuses out there that can think of much more exciting stuff to do, but there are ways of funding those things because of the value of the data that is so important, right? To Wally's point and everybody's point, this is the new oil, so-called. This is what's going to drive the sort of $30 trillion of extra value in the global GDP within the next 10 years. So, back to one of the themes that emerged both from Divya and others, how do we share equitably on that value, right? If companies capture that data and create so much wealth for their shareholders, how can we use data trust to create this sort of data fair trade situation where that value goes back into society, goes back to the citizens, goes back to the patients, the users, the workers, and compensate for the loss of income as well that will come through automation and through pandemics. So there's various ways we can fund this without any government funding. That's what I mean.
Right, without any government funding. And what I find fascinating is what you're saying is this actually might be a way to actually, like you said, if there's data fair trade, for those individuals who are unemployed, this might be a way that we actually may be able to help them, help society as a whole, help companies, and get to what Wally was talking about, which is address the GDP erosion that is happening as a result of COVID-19.
Absolutely. If I may just add one point about the sort of, the workers' problem. We talk about universal basic income, right? And one of the big sort of challenges of UBI is, how do we fund this to be meaningful, right? Right. And maybe one way for us to think about that would be around, that value from data returning back to society and funding some sort of basic income, where income will be very erratic, where, the gig economy will be much more prevalent.
Fascinating. I'm going to now go to real quick with a question to Michael and then Divya and then Wally. But Michael, we've been talking about how we're going to fund this. Obviously, you're living it right now. You're in the midst of it, and it's real. Do you find that there's need for different types of accounting measures or different types of finance measures? Because data is a little bit different than money in some respects. Money, you give it, you don't keep it. Whereas data, you can maybe keep a copy and give a copy. So do we need new ways of doing accounting and finance to address data, or do you find that this is not a problem?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go outside my bailiwick too much into the finance components, and so we don't have the data trust in terms of the data being collected. But I've talked to a lot of folks about this because it is, again, where we live and breathe adjacent to it. So the two problems I think with the funding mechanism is one of the ones you touched on, right? Ownership rights. Do you own the data? Do you own access rights to it? It's kind of like a bundle of sticks. How many of those sticks in that bundle do you really hold when you own your data? The other one, though, which makes it tricky, is the fact that data is both an asset but a contingent liability when it comes to personal data, right? So if I have, gold in a bank, in an account someplace, or cash in a bank account, the odds of that cash turning into a liability for me, if I collect cash from a bunch of people, are relatively de minimis. The more personal data that I gather and gather and gather, the more at the end of the day, there's effectively a contingent liability aspect that comes into it, to the extent I haven't put in place the appropriate mechanisms and procedures and technologies to protect the privacy and the rights related to that data. So that becomes a challenge when it comes to funding it. I do wonder whether, because it's so novel, and because at the end of the day, we just don't have a universally recognized definition even for what a data trust is, I wonder whether, I think we're going to get there in terms of privately funded fungible uses of data, where data is contributed to a trust, and then access to it is effectively sold off in a way, and the value comes back to the contributors. But I wonder if, because money can have a corrupting influence in a way, whether for the clearinghouse aspect of it, it would be great if we started with good nonprofit or accelerator uses of data, to at least get the mechanism going correctly, get all the pipes done, make sure there's kind of a tried and true mechanism, which I don't think we have yet, and then move from there in steps towards, okay, now how do we fund this really? So in my mind, the ideal first pilot programs would be nonprofit uses, ideally, and I know it's Divya's bailiwick really, but in the healthcare space, where if you could get transparent, accountable, clear, consented uses of data for a common good, where some nonprofit or accelerator holds it pursuant to an agreement for the benefit of the beneficiaries, I think that would be a great place to start.
I love how you're like you said, let's start with nonprofit uses, because we've got to figure them out, and then there'll be for-profit uses that will be spun off from that. But let's make the learning process with the public, because there is no textbook for where we're going in a nonprofit benefit space, and quite frankly, could be COVID-19. How do we get out of it? How do we address the economy to get out of it? How do we help inform the health effects? There's so many things around us right now where there's a data coordination problem.
Yeah, and one more point there is really, the tricky thing is, one of the great aspects I think we all touched on with data trust is the transparency of it, right? The beneficiary who contributes to data knows how their data is being used, et cetera. Which it's funny though, because there's a wrinkle there, because these trusts are inevitably somewhat complicated, and the agreements are complicated. And for them to work properly, you need to aggregate data from a lot of sources, maybe millions of people. At that point, you're going to get very varying levels of sophistication in terms of the contributors. And so you inevitably come across the question, how do you design this in such a way that it's complicated enough that it works, and yet simple and straightforward enough that the people have true, GDPR-like clarity in terms of what they're consenting to. And that takes a little bit of time, a little bit of effort. And that's why I wonder whether the walk before you run aspect may be good for at least another year or so as we work through this stuff.
I completely agree with you. And in fact, I think there's been research that shows when companies try to do the right thing right now, and they try to be moral, and they actually try to share what they're doing with your data, as opposed to those companies that just do the bare minimum legal requirement, there's actually a little bit of where people initially freak out, because they're actually getting transparency. And so that's where actually a nonprofit might be able to help with data literacy and say, look, this is actually better than the other things that are going on that you don't know about. Ignorance is not bliss in this space. Let's help educate you. Let's give you data literacy. And that way it can create the platform and an incentive for companies to do the more moral thing, as opposed to just the de minimis legal thing.
Exactly.
So Divya, if you were to make a pitch to, say, a philanthropist or someone that was going to say, I want to do a data trust in a nonprofit, what would be the sort of steps that you would recommend in terms of making it real?
There are several. So I just want to say this has been a really interesting conversation. If you don't mind, David, I just want to touch on just a couple of things that that people have been bringing up. And the all important one is the data ownership piece. So you and I have had this conversation with some other colleagues in the past, and people land in very, very different places. So one example that one of our colleagues had given was, if you walk into a bank and you're transacting and you're captured on that video monitor, right? And they're doing it for security, and they've been very upfront with you that everybody is being taped in some way or watched in some way. Do you have a right to that data? Now, when you do a Google search, do you have a right to your digital exhaust? And people seem to feel more comfortable that your digital exhaust could be owned or used by someone else. But then we move into that health space and your biometrics. And now the question becomes, is the data that my own body generates, my neural signals, my genetic code, are these pieces of me that I own? You could actually take it to a different place and say, well, you don't even completely own your genetic code, because if you choose to transact with it, say to sell it to a company that wants to create data insights from it, you've also sold your parents' genetic code, your siblings' genetic code, your ancestors' genetic code. But for the sake of not being too difficult, I would say that the data that forms the fabric of you, like your genome and your neural signals, your heat signals, anything else given off by your body, I would say that we should be able to, at least in some way, assign data ownership rights to at least that form of data. And now the question becomes, if you're going to create a data trust, how do you, and you know, this all important point of the data literacy of the generators came up. How do you do this when everybody has a very different form of literacy about it, and maybe even cultural feelings about whether or not they own their own data? One way to do that is to superimpose upon this system a means to secure and encrypt that data as it is being generated. So I'm the CMO of a company called Plexus, where we're actually trying to deploy a new network architecture on top of the normal TCP/IP system, where content as it's generated can be named, made interoperable, but secured. So both that data that is at rest, but also data in motion, will always stay encrypted, because ultimately, as others have brought up, the value in that data is when you aggregate it so that you can act upon it to generate those kinds of data insights. And if you have no mechanism for data aggregation, it becomes very hard to do anything in the service of the planet, right? There are federated learning models which use decentralized types of data insights, but they're never as good as the aggregated data insights. For instance, you sometimes will have to add noise to the data sources in order to scramble them enough so that you don't know where it's being generated or who it's assigned to, but then you lose a lot of meaning from it. And so the pitch I would make, David, is let's start in the health space. Let's start with nonprofits. That's a really good, meaningful way to do this, because that seems to imply that there's a global good that we all share. And then in the wake of this pandemic, let's create a global immune system. So that would be my pitch, a system whereby, I mean, you know that the planet is integrating all these many signals coming from all these different biometric sources, and it's acting to maintain balance and homeostasis. That's what it does with those signals. We should be doing this as a species. And in this case, we're not just integrating data from health sources, we are integrating data from things like market insights. We're integrating data that comes from satellites that tells us about animal migrations or the health of the planet's biomes and things of that nature. So we should be instrumenting the planet, yet securing the data as it's generated. And the keys for developing insights should only be given to those that are trusted, who have demonstrate that they will actually care for that trust. And then what you do to the different sources, no matter what their level of data literacy is you ask them questions like we would do in an IRB at a university. Is it okay if we use your data for the sake of understanding what kind of genetics might make people more susceptible to developing a severe case of COVID? Can we use your genetics to determine something else? And let them answer yes or no, what's okay. And we could develop these sort of global IRBs that enable people to use data with people's permission.
Fascinating. And I like what you touched upon, Divya, is recognizing that data in some respects, it's both about an individual right, but also a collective and a community right. And in some respects, we may need to sometimes step beyond our own Western views of data is about the individual, and it's sometimes data about the community. So Wally, I'm going to turn to you because you seem to be doing a lot of interesting tech vanguard efforts. Divya put forward some interesting questions about encryption. I have seen some ideas tossed around that if you can trust that people actually behave legitimacy, so we're not assuming that anyone's trying to game the system, you could actually have a future in which Internet of Things devices that are recording only record if you bring a third key. So if your phone is beaconing and saying, I'm giving permission at this place and time to have my movements recorded or my image recorded in this bank or something like that, and the bank might say, if you don't give permission, you can't enter the bank. But it can actually be something where your presence can give permission whether or not you are giving permission to be observed. What are your thoughts about, do we have any choice when it comes to Internet of Things, or is this just going to happen and unfortunately the baby's already out with the bathwater? I'd be interested in your thoughts there.
Well, I mean, I would say that, you know, for example, in a smart cities deployment, you're going to have cameras out there in the public, and there's really two things you can do. Society has kind of two choices. Like, one, either we figure out a way to secure the chain of custody and be able to assign accountability throughout time and, you know, different uses of the data, which is a complex problem. Something that finds, you know, to be ethically and fiduciary financially acceptable, or we have to turn the cameras off. And I don't think we're going to turn the cameras
right.
off.
Assuming we're not a country of 1.4 billion people, for example, just hypothetically.
Yeah, well, I mean, even, you know, I remember from my memory, you know, the UK was the first country that I saw that was talking about tackling these issues, and, you know, at the time, wow, this is a take note. But I mean, you know, we're working on projects that have to do that as well. So I think that the technology space to address that is largely new ground. We have like the product work that we're doing right now with COVID has to basically provide a chain of custody that can attest to the fact that no data other than limited metadata is coming off this part of the chain or even this part of the edge device. And, you know, through a combination of code signing and open source certain bits of the code and using distributed ledger technology, which we're heavy users of, over software-defined networking, which is really kind of a fancy VPN, you can do this. And you add in trusted computing, which technologies like ARM Trust Zone or Intel SGX security guard extensions, you can take that attestation and put it right into the screen. So, you know, we can build, and we do build chains of custody that allow, you know, mining of insights at an outer ring and a supply chain to bring that into, you know, a refined holding pool where it can be licensed out in the same way that digital rights management does for, you know, for music. And you can secure it right down to the screen. Now, does that mean if I'm looking at, you know, some valuable insight and someone walks behind me and takes a picture? No, we can't protect against that. But
yeah.
that's a pretty big advancement from what's available right now, because this type of chain of custody stuff is really, to me, it's something that, in my opinion, the powers of enterprise, cloud-driven enterprise monetary success over the last 15 years, and I've been working in this industry for a lot longer than that, they're not incentivized. I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy against it, but I'm simply saying that they're just not incentivized to provide for decentralization chains of custody, which is why we got into this business in the first place, to offer a counterbalance, to make it so people who are advantaged by the last mile, which I would argue everyone in the last mile is advantaged by that, which includes everyone in the, you know, everyone who's not those cloud companies. They need some alternative, and that's why we built what we built.
That's very powerful, and I really liked what you said. Is it's not necessarily there's a conspiracy. It's just that if the incentives aren't there, don't be surprised that the water flows a certain way. But if we can put incentives in place, then maybe the water will flow in a different way. So maybe George, this gets back to the question about practical steps. What might be possible incentives you'd want to put in place, or what might be other types of processes? Do we need to think about involving the public in terms of like citizen juries or citizen oversight? Is there a need for third-party ombudsman? I mean, what would you recommend in terms of additional practical steps that we've not discussed?
Well, if I was to sort of summarize what I would do in order to set up a data trust for the public good, let's say, right? I will gather a team of people, maybe everybody on that call, okay, into a room, and we'll think, first of all, we should think together a very good use case for such a pilot, right? And, you know, Divya and others have agreed, and I agree as well, that health is such a great problem where all those themes, you know, the tension between utility versus privacy needs to be solved, where consent needs to be agreed and thought through, you know, it's a really juicy problem with a great outcome for society. So first of all, I would say, we really need a good use case. We definitely need leadership here, right? And leadership can come from various places. I can think of, coming from local government or from social entrepreneurs or from business, right? We need leadership to see this through. We need people to have a stake in the development of those data trusts. And then we can start thinking about what do we need to solve for in order to construct it. And if I was to abstract on everything that people said, we definitely need a legal structure, okay, that is fit for purpose. And maybe Mike can give us a little bit more insight of what that might mean. I mean, he did mention a few things, but we need that kind of legal structure that will deliver the kind of governance and fiduciary responsibility that we need. We need to think about ethics, right? A step higher, okay? What are the core values of the data trust, right? What do we stand for, okay? So ethics plays very, very, very strongly on that. We definitely need to think of technology, absolutely. And both Divya and Wally have given us some examples. Decentralization is perhaps a key, but then again, how do you aggregate data? How do you ensure interoperability? How do you, ensure chain of custody? And finally, and very importantly, the funding bit. Okay, how do we fund this, right? Do we fund it through, issuing bonds? Do we fund it through tokens on a blockchain? Can we think of other ways of funding it? Can we start by, tapping into funds or grants that are there to pilot it? But I think these are the key ingredients that I would put together in order to start this thing going. And in fact, I'm already involved in a project that does exactly that.
Excellent. And maybe we'll circle back a little bit and you can share some details. But since you gave the gauntlet to Michael to talk a little bit more about the legal structure, Michael, if you could talk a little bit more about the legal structure, and then I'm going to ask you a second question, which is after talking about the legal structure, if, say, a VC fund or a billionaire came and said, I want to fund different startups to do different proofs of concept to build this together, what would be your recommendation to the billionaire? And actually, that'll be extended to all of you, but I'm going to go first to Michael to talk a little bit about the legal structure, and then your thoughts about if a billionaire turned to you and said, I want to fund different startups in this space, what would you advise them?
Sure thing. So I'll stick with the standard version of the trust, where it's a common law legal vehicle. You have other, in Netherlands, you have like the stichting and other legal devices, but really we talk about common law jurisdictions. So it varies whether you're in Ireland, the UK, various US states. But in common, again, they all have an asset, be it a company or data or different types of data, beneficiaries, people who contribute the data usually, or the company, the trustees, and an agreement. And the tricky part, like any lawyering though, it gets down to kind of, okay, what are the facts here, right? At the end of the day, what is the asset? Who has it? Who are these beneficiaries? Is it irrevocable? Are they contributing their data, and then do they have the choice to get it back, or is it irrevocable? If they can get it back, then how do you do longitudinal studies on data? Because that's going to be very tricky. With the agreement, what are the rules of the road here for how the data can be used? What happens if you violate those rules? How do you replace the trustees? Who are they? So it gets super complicated, but all these things need to be threshed out. But it all stems from the first original question, which I'd say to the billionaire, which is, but what's the purpose? Rather than potentially going down the rabbit hole of potentially fetishizing the structure and saying, we need a data trust, let's look for a purpose. It should be, here's our purpose. Is the data trust or a form of it the optimal mechanism to achieve that purpose? And that's why I do think that areas such as healthcare are one of those areas where if you said to that billionaire, okay, what are you trying to achieve here? And I said, well, listen, actually, we have certain, there's a pandemic, a COVID pandemic that we're trying to address. We'd love to have more data, but the reality is that we need to gather it. It's a really long process. People are wary as to what's going to happen with it. Well, then you put together a really simple trust. You bring in tech companies to be service providers to it, right? You could have analytics companies. You could have anonymization companies. Trurata, one of our services is anonymization of data. Various technologies that would be applied so that you basically, what you're doing is, again, I mentioned before, having an agreement that's complicated enough to achieve your goals, but simple enough for people to understand it. Well, you also want processes and technology there that get people comfortable. So you'd want to bring those in. And that's, I think, where you go from there. It's basically purpose, partners, processes and tools, you bring it together. From there, it actually becomes simplified over time.
Really like that, and I think you gave a very. I mean, I think we need to just capture that and probably send it to all the philanthropists around the world, because what you described is very pragmatic, action oriented, and very well said, Michael. So Divya, recognize you have to follow up on that. I will change it slightly and say, instead of a billionaire, let's say the U.S. Congress invited you to come before them and say, we want to do a data trust. What would you say to the U.S. Congress about what they should think through in terms of how they might go about doing it, recognizing it doesn't have to be government funded, but at least maybe shaping the incentives so that it could possibly occur?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we need to do is educate the US Congress as to what actually data it is and how it can be used. But that aside, I think that the incentive alignment is one of the most important things. So the first thing I would say is, as the data is transacted upon, who is the primary beneficiary of those data insights? If it's the company or if it's shareholders, then that's absolutely the wrong incentive mechanism. But if it's the people who are generating the data at the sources, or it's there for the public good and it's the public that is the beneficiary of these aggregated data insights, then all of a sudden you understand that something is being done for them and the incentives are going to begin to align in a very different fashion. I would find I would tell the US Congress to understand the deep importance of, even if you can't own all of your own data, to at least be able to encrypt it when necessary so it cannot be used against you, and to provide new means for people who are generating data to track where it's going. So it's not just in the hands of the companies that are collecting it. And finally, I would tell the Congress to reward those companies, whether they're tech companies, data aggregators, for basically building in these rights from the beginning, so that any company that is acting in the public good gets a boost. It's not as if they're losing money for having done this. And as everyone has recognized, the public health space is such an easy place to deploy this, because it is easy to demonstrate that when you act on data centrally that is healthcare oriented, that you are doing a public good. So if we can align those incentive structures so we understand who is the primary recipient of that knowledge, then I think that will go a long way.
Very well said, Divya. And I hope maybe we can circulate this with some staffers, because they need to hear what you're sharing. So thank you for that. Wally, I'm going to do a similar question, but slightly different, especially given your background working in Canada. If the Canadian government said, we want to think about doing data trust in the area of the future of work and helping, like you said, you talked about, employment and unemployment. What would be your recommendations? I mean, we often in the United States, we look sometimes at Canada saying, you seem to have a more benevolent relationship between your government and the people, whereas we seem to be, we had a revolution against the king, so we don't trust our government whatsoever. But what would be your take to recommending sort of a data trust for the future of work for the Canadian government?
Well, I think the answer is probably the same to each of the targets of the last two questions as well, whether it's a billionaire, U.S. Treasury, or the Federal Reserve, or the Canadian government. I think that the idea of, especially in light of all the quantitative easing and stimulus and bond purchase programs out there, I think that asset securitization of data is a natural fit for right now. And if it is, as a Canadian citizen, nothing would make me happier and kind of more proud of being a Canadian if I could see some way of harnessing the value of, we're very ethnically diverse country, when there's generally get along pretty well. It makes me pretty proud to be a Canadian. And the healthcare system that we pay a lot for has a ton of data in it. So, is there a way to take that data, securitize it, issue bonds against it, use those bonds to fund, or not necessarily to fund, but as we're writing all this debt in the first place, why don't we try to get some sort of transformative, sticky economic value out of it, instead of just dumping it into the fractional reserve currency system that all this stuff is unwinding, right? This Bretton Woods post World War II systems kind of at its strain. So why don't we solve a problem and seal a transition and deal with COVID all in one shot with technology and data that we already have? and using financial instruments that we're already issuing. You know, why can't we tie these things together? It is complex, but I mean, you know, COVID's complex. The health outcomes of it. We did a lot of early work in the Ebola crisis in 2014, a ton of it, building testing systems and data trust like architectures, because we're working with some of the people on the vaccine effort, the successful vaccine effort. And there was a belief that it could turn into this really serious global pandemic, which ultimately didn't happen because the vaccine team did a good job. And now those ideas are coming back, but at the same time, they come back with the idea of data asset securitization, financial stimulus, data assets, and 20% unemployment that we didn't think would be here for another 5 years. So, you know, it's going to take a bit of elbow grease, as they say, people around a pretty big table to solve it, but all the recipe is there. So I'm hoping that that's a conversation that can happen.
Excellent. And I hope you're standing by the phone, because what you just outlined, I think, is a very compelling for any government. But like I said, it'd be great to see Canada do it. It'd be great to see the United States and Europe do it. George, if you could bring it home to us before we go to the lightning round, you know, if you had to explain to any audience, like, what's in it for them if they take the path of piloting a data trust, what would be the sort of like bullet points you would say as to here's what you're going to get if you are willing to pilot it?
I think we all need to communicate and understand the big why behind data trust, which is we need to find a way to solve the problems of the fourth industrial revolution when it comes to how we fund government budgets, how we fund a labor market that has a very erratic pattern of working and income, and how we sustain the system of liberal democracy when the liberal democratic system is under so much pressure. And as we look for solutions in these huge problems, we need to understand that there is a new way of creating economic value in the AI economy. And that way is very much based around data. So we really need to think hard about data. If we look, for example, in other societies, like say in China, who are not sort of liberal democracies, they have an approach to data, okay, that it doesn't take into account, you know, the nuances that we're just discussing now around privacy, okay? But we're not the Chinese. We need to find ways of balancing both, you know, democratic rights, civil liberties, privacy, creation of value, the sustaining a middle class is really important. And I think the data trust concept is perhaps one of the tools that we need in order to think those problems through, because it reintroduces this idea of data equity, if you like, right? That, you know, the value that's going to be created out of the data can be shared more equitably across society. And I think this is the big idea here. If we are, you know, if we adopt this idea as something that excites us and enthuses us, then I can see, you know, 1,000 different data trusts emerging, right? You know, workers' unions, association, patient groups, citizen groups, local councils. You know, there's so much opportunity out there to self-organize and start, you know, claiming that part of in the AI economy.
Very well said. And what you said got me thinking that, you know, we have around the world certified public accountants, which are both demonstrating knowledge of how to do something, but also a code of ethics and an obligation to the profession as a whole. So they're not just to that company, but to the profession as a whole, that if something's wrong with the books, then they're supposed to actually come out and say something's wrong with the books. Maybe what we need is, whether it's with certified public accountants that actually specialize in data trust, or certified data trust accountants or something like that, we need to create a professionalization of people that are committed to making data trust happen as a step forward. So now we're going to switch to the lightning round. And again, this has been a very remarkable conversation. I really appreciate both the breadth and the depth of what we've done. But I'm going to turn first to Wally, then Michael, Divya, and then George will bring it home for us to close. And looking for 2 to 3 tweet length takeaways that, if you were recommending it to, whether it's you know, a family member, whether it's a community friend, whether it is the Prime Minister of, you know, the United Kingdom or something like that, what would you say as 2 to 3 tweet length takeaways that you want them to have when it comes to data trust? So Wally?
Well, I mean, data trust facilitate interoperability between people and applications, and that's what's needed to restart the economy. So, you know, be very interesting to see what happens over the next month in North America with return to school. But it's going to be a tough time, I believe, for the next year. And I really think we're going to have to take data from public health and make it interoperate with data from other places like employment, manufacturing, supply chain, build in that resiliency, or it could be a pretty long winter, especially here in Canada. So, I think, I mean, I'm talking my book, we make these products, but we went into this early on in the cycle because we felt that this is going to be pretty important. So you want to know how to pilot data trust, or what to do, use a data trust to make your business more resilient and get your employees back, and let's get this economy restarted.
Excellent. And thank you both for everything that you're doing now, as well as for your foresight. Like you said, COVID-19 has accelerated trends that we thought were probably 10 years off are here now. And like you said, we have a choice between a very long winter or finding a way to actually start to thaw off some of the things that are happening. So Michael, similarly, whether it's a family member, community leader, or the Prime Minister for the United Kingdom, what would be your pitch as terms of 2 or 3 tweet links takeaways here?
Sure thing. I'd say, first of all, let's start with where we are, right? We have a problem when it comes to data, in that there's an unrelenting need to use it, but it inherently conflicts with fundamental privacy rights. So let's go back to kind of some fundamental legal points that go back all the way to Roman times, and that's where the trust structure comes from, right? This idea of fiduciary responsibilities that are more than just the profit-based relationship that you get in the corporate area. So let's go back to fundamentals here. Look to the trust structure to add kind of a unique way to address a fundamental problem that we face as a society. And then there are 2 ways to do that. One, you could put a company in a trust, and that's a great way in certain very surgical circumstances to take a company that's dealing with very sensitive data at the heart of what it does, and again, tell the world that it's rising to a higher standard than what its legal obligations are. Or you can have more of the clearinghouse model, where people contribute their data, and that gets at, again, giving people what they deserve, which is transparency, consent, and accountability, while at the same time not allowing their data to become effectively a wasted asset, when that's the last thing we as a society can endure right now.
Wow, very powerful. And I liked what you said, which is either A, as a company, step up and do something beyond the bare minimum, respond to the moral higher ground, or 2, meet people where they are and make sure they get what they truly deserve in a people-centered world. So Divya, that's kind of a hard act to follow with Wally and Michael, but I know you can do it, and that's why I'm always glad to have you here. What would be your 2 to 3 tweet links takeaways?
I would say to build privacy and security into any system in which people are donating their data, rather than making it an afterthought. In order to develop data trusts, we have to actually include data sources, the producers of the information, and both educate them as to the uses of their data, but also give them the power to transact with it. And finally, data trusts can be pressure tested by understanding who the beneficiaries are. So if it's the individuals who are producing the data or the public good, then those data trusts are acting for the purpose of the right thing. But if those insights or that profit is going back into the pockets of shareholders or being leveraged against the data producers, then that trust has been violated.
Fascinating. And Divya, I look forward to being in the pressure cooker with you as we try to help make this happen. So George, bring it home for us. What would be your 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations that you would have to world leaders?
I would say that we need to maybe rethink this concept of data in terms of something that is of social value, something like perhaps like a public good in itself, the data commons, if you like. I've been to similar conversations like Divya mentioned before, where there was a debate around data ownership. And I think we need to stop thinking perhaps of individual ownership, because it's really an intractable problem, and start thinking of data as the commons, if you like. Okay. And if we start thinking like that, then, how do we manage those commons, right? What tools do we have that come from, economics that can help us understand how to manage the data commons of the 21st century? How do we put together governance structures that deliver equity, right? And fair share? And how do we do that whilst at the same time empowering innovation and entrepreneurs to use this data in order to find solutions? You see, one of the big problems that entrepreneurs have in startups always is lack of data, right? Okay, that's the constant problem that the startups have. So maybe we can solve a few problems at the same time and increase the speed of innovation. So I would say, think data commons, think giving access to data to innovators, think of a future where data delivers value to society. I think these three things are very, very important as we strategize for the future.
Very well said, and I liked what you said about thinking about that it really is a collective commons, and to sort of paraphrase, if we went from thinking about I, which is illness, to we, that is wellness, we can actually make a world that changes. And so I look forward to where we can go together. Thank you all for being an amazing panel. Really appreciate you joining us and look forward to the steps we can do forward in the months ahead because data trusts are needed. And I thank you all for being positive change agents.